room and forget my papers. Anyway, thank you all for coming, by the way. So, we stand on the cusp of an extinction crisis on a scale only seen 5 times before in the history of the planet. If that hasn't caught your attention, I'm not sure what would. According to the IUCN Red List, 36% of species on the planet are threatened with extinction. That's only the species that we know about. And estimates vary that this is from 1,000 to 10,000 times the background rate of extinction. The past 5 extinction level events on the planet have been caused by either changes to global temperature, sea level rises, or changes in marine chemistry. The 5th, the famous KT event that did for the dinosaurs, was caused, as we all know, by a catastrophic meteorite crashing into the Earth. And given the rate of changes taking place on the planet and in the planet at the moment due to human activity, it's not too much of a stretch, I think, to think of ourselves as a similar kind of planetary cataclysm. According to Edward O. Wilson, and this is a quote on your handout if you have one in front of you, human impact from prehistory to the present time and projected into the next several decades threatens to be the greatest extinction spasm since the end of the Mesozoic era 65 million years ago. The 5 previous major spasms of the past 550 million years, including the end Mesozoic, each required about 10 million years of natural evolution to restore. What humanity is doing now in a single lifetime will impoverish our descendants for all time to come. What I want to think about today is what effect does this have on our capacity to imagine, to make worlds in our imagination, and to meet the world around us through our imagination. How can we think of the world when it is being so drastically, radically depleted through our own actions? How do we think our relationship with the world around us when we are, in a sense, that world's catastrophe? And further to that, what I want to pursue is the question of whether enchantment can be a viable response to this situation, a viable response to extinction. What does it mean to think about the value of enchantment, and what form of enchantment remains possible and available to us in a time of loss? Can we remain enchanted by a world that is disappearing around us, and what good could that possibly do? According to Jane Bennett, this is very much possible. The mood of enchantment, she says, may in fact be valuable for ethical life. Jane Bennett is I guess you'd say, an environmental philosopher whose work is associated with an intellectual movement called New Materialism. New Materialism argues that we need to re-enchant the world, re-enchant our sense of the world, by discovering the dynamism and the liveliness that is inherent in all entities, organic and inorganic, living and inanimate. Matter is not inert, but according to Bennett, very much a vibrant thing with life and agency. New materialism is essentially an attempt to bring the humanities, thinking and practice within the humanities, up to speed with current scientific thinking about the deep strangeness of the world around us, the fact that the world is so much stranger than we might previously have thought, whether this is through the insights of quantum physics or the study of the behaviours of bacteria and so on. I read recently that bacteria might be said to possess a kind of language, some kinds of bacteria, because of the chemical signals that they pass between one another. It's just incredible, crazy stuff. What new materialism tries to do is to bring this sense of the queerness, of the oddness, the strangeness of life to bear on how we think about how that life is represented and approached. It looks to break down barriers between human and non-human by investigating the liveliness of all bodies, all entities, and by reorienting that sense of the non-human not as the negative arm of a kind of binary, but as what David Abrams called a community of expressive presences. Bodies are less bounded, more permeable than we might typically have thought. And it's with these questions in mind that I want to argue for the enchantment of connections and connectedness, that the ethical value of enchantment and wonder is discoverable in the links we find between ourselves and the other entities that compose the worlds we inhabit. And we can see some of this, I think, in the work of poets and essayists like Kathleen Jamie. As she has said herself, the role of the poet is not to be political, but shamanic. It's the only word I can think of, and that's a really characteristic Kathleen Jamie qualification. Mediating between various worlds and bringing messages back and forth between them. I feel I am and always will be in negotiation with the languages and cultures and tradition which surround and pressurise me. Not to mention gender, not to mention negotiation with the wider world around us, not to mention the other negotiations one carries out between self and God, self and world, and yes, private self. Role, the role of the poet to mediate between reader and, as the idea of the poet Shaman carries, an enchanted world, to mediate between the reader, the audience, and a sense of an enchanted worldliness. But the other, I think more crucially, is this idea of negotiation. And what I want to try and draw out is that in Kathleen Jamie's negotiation between the thinking, feeling, expressing, perceiving self and the vibrant, lively, eloquent world encountered by that self, we can discover a form of enchantment that is also a passage to the flow of entanglement with that world. So, now, this all sounds very nice, but of course, being caught up in the flow of a deeply and inherently entangled world can be also quite a dangerous, even lethal experience, as we find in the first poem on your handout, which is Kathleen Jamie's Frogs. But for her green palpitating throat, they lay inert as a stone, the male fastened like a package to her back. They became, as you looked, almost beautiful. Her back mottled to leafy brown, his marked with two stripes, pale as overwintered grass. When he bucked once, neither so much as blinked. Their oval, gold-lined eyes held some bog-dull imperative. The card that would smear them into one, belly into belly, tongue thrust utterly into soft brain, approached and passed on. Oh, how we press on! The car and passengers, the slow creatures of this earth, the woman by the verge with her hands cupped. Now, on the face of it, this might seem quite a rather deeply unenchanting scene. It's a poem about roadkill, effectively. However, I think there's something really, really fascinating about the gesture that closes the poem. This image of the woman by the verge with her hands cupped. The poem as a whole describes, I think, a series of connections, some through kind of natural imperatives, others through moments of violence and disregard. The cars and passengers, the slow creatures of this earth, this woman, they are all bound together in this moment of, I guess, interruption, you might put it that way, all connected, but in many cases unaware of that connection. But what connects the woman to the scene, and what is the right or appropriate way to read this gesture, the woman by the verge with her hands cupped? What does it represent? Does it represent loss, emptiness, care, grief, a kind of prayer and supplication, or even a kind of bearing witness? What's the significance, the impetus behind this gesture? It's left unclear, as you'll see. But as a whole, I think this poem is very characteristic of Kathleen Jamie's approach to these kinds of questions, through its mode of quiet tension, its negotiation of the quotidian or everyday and the marvellous, the sense of the mystery of connectedness, of something that is both withdrawn and tangible at the same time. We might, if we were feeling slightly bold, want to contrast this poem with Seamus Heaney's Death of a Naturalist. But coming near the beginning of Jamie's collection, The Tree House, which is really where she starts to address a lot of these questions about her relationship with the natural world, with the non-human, more directly. It signifies less Heaney's sense of revulsion at the natural world, and more the emergence of Jamie's impulse to connect, to discover what it means to connect, what lies behind connection, and what is an appropriate form of approach to this connected reality. So what I want to do in exploring this question is think about what gesture is appropriate when we come to approach extinction, particularly species loss, death on this tremendous scale, via three kinds of encounter with species endangerment in Kathleen Jamie's writing. First of all, peregrines, then plastics, and finally pelagics, that is whales and basking sharks. And in each case I want to examine the extent to which and the ways in which Kathleen Jamie negotiates, as she has said, an enchanted encounter with loss. Moving on firstly to peregrines. I want to start thinking about Kathleen Jamie's encounter with peregrines and birds of prey via another text, a text that I imagine many of you may have come across, J.A. Baker's The Peregrine of 1967, which has really become a kind of touchstone for contemporary nature writing. I'm sure some would agree with that. It's referred to again and again. It's seen as a kind of text, if you like, to how many contemporary nature writers seek to present their own encounters, engagements with the natural world. In The Peregrine, though, Baker himself is, as you'll know if you've read it, a rather shadowy figure, virtually absent from his own text, which is almost entirely preoccupied with his efforts to trace and memorialise the catastrophic decline in peregrine numbers that had taken place by the early 1960s. Between 1939 and 1962, 50% of, or there had been a 50% decline in peregrine numbers in this country. A really catastrophic fall in numbers of what had been a very populous, albeit migratory bird. The peregrine is a composite account of 10 years Baker spent stalking peregrines in his native Essex. It's told as the diary of a single migratory season, and it's not given exactly in the text, but some of the fact that it's a very severe winter, for example, when he's writing about his encounters with peregrines, we can roughly place it at 1962-1963, which places it around the time, ironically, that Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, another iconic text of ecology that, in this case, really motivated the environmental movement in the United States. Now, it's worth pointing out that peregrine numbers have recovered in this country. We have, according to the RSPB's latest figures, around 1,500 breeding pairs in this country. It's now an animal of least concern on the red list. However, as Kathleen Jamie's recent poem Wings Over Scotland indicates, which I think is on your handout, human land management practices continue to present a number of very severe hazards to birds of prey, so this is still a live issue. I won't read it out, but Wings Over Scotland is interesting to put alongside the peregrine in a number of ways. One of the characteristic features of the peregrine, Baker's text, is that he pursues the bird via its kills. He searches for the evidence of its predation. And in a sense we get an ironised and inverted version of that here with the series of poisoned birds of prey that Jamie itemises. And despite the rather poised formal language of Wings Over Scotland as a kind of found poem, as she says at the end of the collection, there is nonetheless a kind of sense of shared anger, I think, between Baker and Jamie. Baker very forcefully puts it in the peregrine. Many die on their backs, clutching insanely in their last convulsions, withered and burnt away by the filthy, insidious pollen of farm chemicals. And elsewhere Jamie has written about a similar sense of humiliating living creatures in the manner in which we treat them with such profound disregard. So the peregrine is very much a text about incipient extinction. The peregrine at that point represented a kind of zombie species. It was clearly on its way out when Baker was writing, despite its subsequent recovery. It's also been valued, though, more recently, for the way it presents a refreshed perspective on human encounters with animals, and particularly in Baker's efforts to conjure
a non-human perspective in his text. As he says, the peregrine sees and remembers patterns we do not know exist, the neat squares of orchard and woodland, the endlessly varying quadrilateral shapes of fields. He finds his way across the land by a succession of remembered symmetries. It's a very immersive text. It's one that gets, I think, its ethical charge from its ardent, if admittedly impossible, urge to decenter the human perspective that governs it. And as Jamie has said about J.A. Baker in her essay on Baker's writing, in Findings, Baker writes like a falcon must see. Baker writes like a falcon must see, and so allows us to see too. But the question at hand, I think, to see what? What is it that Baker allows us to see in writing in this fashion? Well, a possible answer to this comes in another essay of Jamie's, Pathologies, which finds Kathleen Jamie in a pathology lab peering down a microscope at a bacterial landscape. I was looking down from a great height upon a pink countryside, a landscape. There was an estuary with a north bank and a south. In the estuary were wing-shaped river islands or sandbanks, as if it were low tide. It was astonishing, a map of the familiar. It was our local river, as seen by a hawk. It's like the Tay, I said, at low tide, with the sandbanks. I drove home along the river. I'd fancied I'd seen in the poor man's liver cells. The tide was in, no sandbanks. The inner body, plumbing and landscapes and bacteria. The outer world also had flown open like a door, and I wondered as I drove, and I wonder still, what is it that we're just not seeing? Now in this passage, as you'll have noticed, Jamie is rather self-consciously echoing the kind of perspective that Baker conjures, the kind of hawk's vision that he plays with. It's also a moment in which Jamie is fascinated by the fractal qualities that this kind of perspective makes available, the astonishing resemblance across vastly different scales, the minutiae of the body, and the kind of aerial perspective of a landscape. But it's also an extract that gives us, I think, a real sense of passage and confluence or opportunity that appears throughout Kathleen Jamie's work. The outer world flown open like a door, but opening out onto what? What remains hidden from view and what is made available to us when we take this kind of approach. Well, I think in a sense Jamie answers her own question in the Baker essay, which reflects on what it meant to her to encounter peregrines for herself in her local town, alongside reading Baker's text. And the passage I want to read here actually gives us a kind of inverted perspective, with Kathleen Jamie earthbound and looking up rather than looking down. In the afternoon, when the mist had burned off and the day became hot, I took the book, The Peregrine, outside, intending to begin it. It was the school holidays, and our children and next doors were playing in the garden. I settled to read and at once learned that the peregrine's eyes are bigger and heavier than my own. Suddenly a formation of fighter jets sheared overhead. I wanted to cover my ears, but made myself keep listening, to hear what birds did. My son came running up to me, then came another outrage of noise, 3 more jets tearing through the pale sky. My son is 7. He wanted to jump in excitement. He wanted to run indoors and draw fighter planes. Later, the radio said that RAF Lucas had welcomed home its tornadoes from Iraq. Those must have been the very planes that had screamed over our garden, in formation, home from the faraway war we had watched on TV. The jet's terrible noise had obliterated all else, but the garden birds took up their twitterings at once, green finches and the plum trees. I looked for the peregrines later, but they were not there. J. Baker writes, the peregrine lives in a pouring away world of no attachment, a world of wakes and tilting, of sinking plains, of land and water. I could envy that sometimes. Later still, my son asked if we were to be bombed. No, I said, we will not be bombed. I think that's a brilliant passage, and I think its brilliance lies in the fact that it has exactly the same kind of rich but unforced associativeness as we might find in a lyric poem of Kathleen Jamie's. For instance, we have the subtle intertwining of reading Baker with the returning tornadoes, which draws together a heritage of bioengineering in aircraft design. The peregrine baffles the cone-shaped bones in its nostrils that prevent its lungs from collapsing when it enters a stoop, or a feature of its physiognomy that influenced the same solution in jet engine design. The passage also features a kind of expanded perspective moving out from the domestic scene and the reading of Baker to create a sense of global connectedness. For one thing, falcon is a migratory bird with a global distribution. But it also mingles together contexts of violence, the Iraq War and the peregrine's efficiency as a hunter, other birds' fear of the raptor, and a civilian's fear of bombing. All in all, this sense of global and planetary interconnectedness might be said to present a kind of what Ursula Heiser has called eco-cosmopolitanism, an attitude that allows a sense of place to be augmented by a sense of planet. So what Kathleen Jamie's encounters with Baker and Peregrine demonstrate, I think, is that a sense of connection, however marked by violence, however marked by intrusion or rupture, is available if we start to pay attention, or the right kind of attention. We don't occupy a world of no attachment, as Baker supposes of the peregrine, but one that is deeply attached in many different, in fact all different directions. So standing in her garden, Kathleen Jamie is the fulcrum of a constellation of connections that wheel around her through the long durée of evolutionary time and the febrile time of geopolitical conflict. And despite the everydayness of this scene, it carries a sense, I think, of deep time in the implied connection between the peregrine's physicality and the human appropriation of this in technological terms, which brings us to thinking more broadly about species. According to the environmental philosopher Tom Van Doren, each species on the Earth represents what he calls a flightway, a line of movement through evolutionary time, composed of behaviours and adaptations developed and inherited over unimaginable timescales. But a process that also is crucially, of course, ongoing. A species, Van Doren says, is always more than its current manifestation. And in Kathleen Jamie's poem Molt, we find, I think, an engagement with this kind of deep time sensibility. At a certain time of year come floating shorewards innumerable seabirds, primaries and coverts. Though they're dead things washed upon the sand, each carries a part, a black tip, say, to the veins, or the pattern that outstretched wings. So I'll start that again. Each carries a part, a black tip, say, to the veins, of the pattern the outstretched wing displays. What can one frayed feather tell of that design, or the covenant they undertake, wind and kittiwake? And Molt, I think, for me, is a poem about pattern and coherence. What looked like the disjecta membra of the rack line also point for Jamie to a profound sense of connection, series of connections, a series of flightways through evolutionary time that have gradually produced this covenant between wind and wing. We might also note the sense of the sacred here that echoes a sense of the shamanic poet's role. Each feather and the bird that shed it also represents what Deborah Bird Rose has called knots in embodied time, a kind of stitching together and knotting together of the long inheritance of evolution. And it's in the undoing of these knots, through the rupture of species death, that we also find a breaking of this covenant between wind and wing, and therefore a kind of double death. Again, as Van Doren has said, extinction is the loss not of a single fixed kind, never mind a single living being, but also of a potentially limitless set of emergent and branching flightways from the present into the diversity of future. So poems like Molt, I think, alert us to the enchanting fact of our connection with very deep time, but also implicitly to the scandal when this connection is abused and ruptured. But what about other matter that is deposited on the beach? If you have read Kathleen Jamie's essays in particular, you'll know that she's a committed collector of what washes up on the tide line. And it's not always items that are as picturesque as that's found in Molt. And what I want to read now is an extract from another beachcombing expedition in Findings. Can you believe all this plastic, all these floats, bottles, all this plastic rope? The cleavages between the sand dunes where the wind and waves had driven it were choked with plastic. If it got beyond the rampart of dunes, it was strewn across the flat of the island. They had their own fascination, the shampoo and milk cartons, the toilet cleaner bottles we could turn over with our feet. The colours were faded and the labels gone. We knew their shapes, had seen them ranked in supermarkets and hardware stores. Brushes, masking tape, training shoes, orange polypropylene net. Here in the rain with the rotting whale and wheeling birds, the plastic floats and turquoise rope, the sealskins, driftwood and rabbit skulls, a crashed plane didn't seem untoward. If a whale, why not an aeroplane? If a lamb, why not a training shoe? It's worth pointing out that earlier in this account, Jamie and her party have come across, amongst other things, the corpse of a whale, which we'll return to in a moment, and the wreckage, the mysterious wreckage of a light aircraft. But the other objects, the more quotidian ones, she says have their own fascination. Well, what's enchanting here about toilet cleaner bottles and shampoo bottles and milk cartons? Perhaps it's the surprise of connection in this particular moment of familiar things in an unfamiliar setting. What enchants here also, I think, in a particular way, is the significant threat to life that we find in this scene as well. Plastic discarded in the ocean, and there's a great deal of it discarded in the ocean, as you'll know, breaks down into plastic particulate or microplastics, so-called nurdles, also known as mermaid's tears, tiny bits of plastics, typically 1.5 millimeters across, that are very similar in appearance to fish eggs, and therefore are eaten by animals in marine life that would typically consume fish eggs. There's recently estimated to be about 15.25 trillion of these plastic particles in the world's oceans, weighing broadly 270,000 tons. As I said, they mimic the natural foods of many animals and therefore enter the food chains. They also act as kind of chemical sponges, so they absorb toxins and magnify the effect of the introduction of this into the food chain quite dramatically. Even when we're not talking about tiny plastic particles, it's also recently been estimated that 90% of seabirds worldwide have some form of plastic in their gut. And this also affects us as things enter the food chain and enter the marine environment. I don't know if anyone saw this in the news, but recently it was publicised that, my figure's right here, 12,000 particles of plastic are thought to be found in your average pound of sea salt. If you're going home tonight and cooking a nice meal for yourself with some fancy sea salt, then try not to think about this talk, basically, because you may be engaging in the plastic ocean, as it's called. So in answer to Jamie's question, if a whale might want an aeroplane, if a lamb wanted a training shoe, we might think that's quite straightforward, because these things ought not to be there, because they are hazardous, because they are dangerous to life. However, as Jamie herself has also said, it's all nature. We can't make distinctions about what to admit about good and bad nature. The plastic of your pen has its resource in oil, which is part of the natural world. The breast milk of polar bears has chemicals in it. There's nothing untouched. To hanker after the truly wild is a fantasy. What Jamie's inviting us to do is interrogate our instinctive response between good and bad nature, between what might be thought of as natural and artificial, or natural and cultural, human and non-human, again, to challenge our sense of what belongs anywhere. By association, to think about the privileged status of so-called wild spaces, and as Bill McKibben has said, the global reach of anthropogenic air pollution means that there's really no longer any place on the planet that isn't touched by human activity in some way. As Gay Hawkins has said, we can think about things as ordinary, or as even as unappealing as plastic bags, as enchanting, as offering us enchanting possibilities. Hawkins has suggested that objects that might sometimes be defined by their disposability, even as a kind of transgressive object, through that disposability, that we get rid of these plastic bags that we manufacture in great quantities, as if they then disappear, when in fact they cause tremendous harms. We're encouraged to think of these as kind of phobic objects or dangerous matter from Hawking's perspective, but we can also, without denying their potential harms, consider how plastic might also enchant us, prompt us to behave differently, as she puts it. Plastic bags, according to Gay Hawkins, are things we are caught up with. They are the materialisation of a dense web of association and connection. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to talk about plastic bags, but I'm going to talk about plastic bottles. I brought my own prop. Because we can use objects like this to think about the kind of connections, imaginative and material, that we enter into when we take hold of an object like this. And this is I'm not entirely sure exactly what form of plastic this particular bottle is made from, but most plastic bottles in circulation are made from PET, polyethylene terephthalate, excuse my pronunciation there, which is petrochemical in origin. Now, PET was developed by the US chemical company DuPont in the 1940s. Everyone sees plastic bottles around. We know that they are a common feature of life in the 21st century. Did you know that in 2006 2.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide was required to manufacture plastic bottles globally, and it takes 3.5 litres to manufacture a plastic bottle that will contain 1 litre of water. So there's something very disproportionate going on here. But there's also something quite interesting about what kinds of entanglement we enter into when we grasp a bottle like this. Holding a bottle introduces us to a startling, I think, series of imaginative and material connections. First of all, between deep past and a very uncertain future. There's recently been quite a dramatic rise in the consumption of bottled water in Saudi Arabia, for instance, 52.4% between 2007 and 2012. So having been extracted as oil out of the ground, probably from the Middle East, it's now pouring back into that region as plastic in a new form. A kind of return of the undead, a return of fossilised material, but at what cost to the kind of pollution of that environment? Perhaps more pointedly, though, a plastic bottle like this connects in front of us a history of human violence and a history of, or a moment rather, a time of ecological violence. DuPont, the company that developed this material, also was responsible for the manufacture of 40% of gunpowder in the First World War, so much so that they were actually given the nickname the Merchants of Death. And they also, several decades later, developed Freon, one of the CFCs linked to ozone depletion. So there's a kind of connection between different kinds of violence going on here, just as we might have found in Baker's reading of the Peregrine. But it also connects us to the ways in which the status of nature, supposedly a kind of a pristine entity, is changing and adapting according to human influences. A phrase that's doing the rounds at the moment in some kinds of environmental ecological debates is the plastosphere. You might have heard of different terms for the kind of new ecological era we are in. The Anthropocene is one. You might have come across the Homogocene. I think is quite nice to refer to the kind of the decline in biodiversity. But the plastosphere refers to the fact that we are plasticizing our environments, particularly marine environments, in really quite dramatic ways. And this is having an equally dramatic effect on marine biology. As I said, these items, they don't biodegrade as much as photodegrade. They're broken down by sunlight and by the action of waves into these minute particles. And these particles are ingested by various kinds of life forms, not just kind of marine mammals and fish and so on, but also there are bacteria now that have been discovered that digest these kind of plastics, further releasing harmful toxins into the food chain. There's also a particular kind of bacteria, Vibrio bacteria, that causes cholera, that's been discovered colonising plastic particulate, that allows it to travel further and live for longer and spread its pernicious effects further on. Ingested plastic in certain kinds of marine life also acts as an endocrine disruptor, a chemical pollutant that's therefore causing biological changes in marine life. And just to grasp a hold of this bottle, I think, in a way connects us to this kind of imaginative and material sense of entanglement with these changes and with these histories of violence and and rupture. What I think this reveals, to me at least, you may not be persuaded, is the density of our entanglements with the intensely lively matter of the oceans. As Stefan Helmreich has said, the human and oceanic flow into one another. At a molecular scale, human bodies, he says, are porous to ocean-borne viruses and bacteria, for example. So as I said at the beginning, bodies are less bounded, more porous and permeable than we might have thought. What I want to move on to is from thinking about plastics and the kind of the flows of the plastic ocean. If I've got time, how am I doing, Greg?
I'm not sure.
I've got about another 5 minutes.
I think I help you turn my phone off.
Well, I'll be slightly quick.
Yeah.
Okay. Thinking about another kind of entanglement with extinction, which is whaling. Now, in the same beachcombing encounter described earlier, Kathleen Jamie expresses her fascination with a dead whale and the regret that she feels at not touching it. It was the heaviest creature I'd ever seen, she said, dead and out of the water's buoyancy, a massive failure. I thought about touching it with just one figure, furtively, the way a gull pecks, and I wish I had now because I've never touched a whale and probably won't get the chance now. Her encounters with whaling and the remnants of whaling represent a particularly poignant instance, I think, of her efforts to find an appropriate gesture by which to bear witness to loss and how loss touches us as well. 19th century commercial whaling decimated the whale populations. It's thought that 90% of blue whales were victims to whaling. As Heathcote Williams has said, it was a marine holocaust, but one that generated the implacable human appetite for electricity, petroleum and plastic. And whaling does, I think, in a real way represent a precursor to the perpetual cultural age that we now inhabit. Another kind of oily encounter between human and animal, because in the most part whales were hunted for their oils. Whale oil had a variety of uses. Candles, margarine and soap were the three main ones. So whale oil quite literally lit the modern world in the peak of whaling. But it also produced glycerin, for use in manufacturing nitroglycerin, which connects us again to a history of violence. Whale glycerin was so vital to the war effort in the First World War that in 1916 the Ministry of Munitions made unlicensed trade in whale oil illegal. It's also used to oil the machinery of the industrial age, particularly clocks and watches and so on. But whalebone was also thought to be effectively the plastic of the 18th and 19th centuries, used to manufacture stays, buttons, umbrellas, hoops, you name it. So it's a very kind of modern material in many ways. And in her visit to Valsa and the whale hole in the Natural History Museum at Bergen in Norway, Kathleen Jamie encounters some of the deadly ironies of modernity's ongoing entanglement with whales. A silence, an aura, call it what you will, emanated from the skeleton, and so the bones recalled their flesh. I looked a little longer and began to realise there was a smell too when you got close. Warm and slight, not unpleasant, it seemed to be seeping from within the bones, as though cleaning them had released it from a long imprisonment. It was the smell of something from, a long time ago, early days of primary school. The vertebrae in front of me felt grainy, not quite cold, and very slightly waxy. Wax crayons, that's the smell, the thick ones. Chubby stumps, we called them. Probably made of whale oil, Gordon said. Most things were. So Jamie enters here a space that is both hushed and homely. It's possessed of an aura of the sacred. It's like a hall of the dead. But it's also one that evokes a very deeply sensual resonance of childhood. But it's also one in which she encounters the ubiquity of whale oil in the material culture of modernity. Most things were made from it. It's therefore a keen instance of the particular liveliness of this aspect of whale biology, that by their deaths in unprecedented numbers, whales very much made the world that we live in. And one of the jobs of the museum that Jamie visits, the whale hole, is to preserve specimens, and she spends time therefore working with conservators. The end of her rib rested on a cushion of foam so it wouldn't be damaged. Do not touch the animals. Sometimes our species beggars belief. I scooshed some more ammonia onto mine, sponged it off again. Across the hall, the crowd of whales awaited their turn for treatment, huge and otherworldly. Not otherworldly, actually of this world, as they had been for a very long time, long before we appeared. I turned the rib in my hand, stroked it with the sponge. Shame and shame. How clean does it have to be, Marianne? All unwitting, I'd asked the conservators question of questions. she smiled. Now there is, I think clearly, a very deep irony here, cleaning whales in order to make soap, so cleaning whales that were killed in order to make soap being kind of the top level of this, but how clean does this need to be in order to expiate the shame of that slaughter? What Jamie's doing here, I think, is testing the resolve of this relationship between care and connection. Handling the rib recalls, I think, in some ways, the woman's gesture in Frogs, fraught with an agonised sense of something falling through her grasp, even as she expresses also a sense of being caught up with that, being caught up in the wider, more entangled world, and a desire to bear witness to this intimacy with loss. This is a recurrent feature of Jamie's encounters of this kind. And just to close, I want to think about briefly a poem where some of these questions come together from the treehouse, which is called Basking Shop. When I came to the cliff edge and lay down, all beneath was space, then green tinted sea, so clear it revealed level below level, not void but a living creature. Behind me Peatmore careered inland. I gripped sweet rock, but it was only resting, birthed as though drawn by the cliff's peculiar backwash. Precisely that its o'er-heavy body and head, the tail fin measuring back forth like a haunted door, could come to sense the absolute limits of its realm. While it hung steady as an anvil, but for the fin's corrective rippling, dull, dark, and buoyed like a heart that goes on living through a long grief, what could one do but watch? The sea heaved, full mast slid by on static wings, the shark not ready yet to re-enter the ocean, travel there peaceable and dumb, waited and was watched, till it all became unbearable, whereupon the wind in its mercy breathed again, and far below the surface glittered and broke up. This is a lovely poem, I think, a quiet, modulated poem, modest in the evasive sense of the eye that kind of disappears behind the sea. It conforms in some ways to Jane Bennett's definition of enchantment as a moment of temporary suspension, transfixed by pure presence. But it's also a moment, I think, of passage to an enlarged sense of coherence with the world. Jamie adopts the same perspective as she does in the scene in Peregrines, looking down. We might note how her disorientation contrasts with the assured presence of the top of the shark. She grips the rock while it's steadied as an anvil. It's a scene that's alive to a sense of vibrant matter, the sense of the confirmed strength of potential in the metal of the anvil, something that really only realises its potential when it comes to meet the action of the hammer. Also in the sense that the shark is also exactly fitted to its place, birthed precisely so that it might come to sense the absolute limits of its realm. And the tail fin, like a haunted door, brings to mind, to my mind at least, Jamie's uncanny experience in pathologies when the outer world flew open like a door. And I wondered what it is we're just not seeing, what haunts these scenes. Again, for Jamie, the enchanted moments are moments of passage to a greater sense of entanglement with that which might have seemed separate. It's a beautifully balanced poem. It's 2 and 3 beat lines, its internal rhyme creating a latticed sense of coherence. It revealed level below level, not void but a living creature, heavy body and head, but also one that mediates between a sense of presence and absence, both the presence and absence of Jamie herself and of the basking shark. Basking sharks are a rapidly declining global species. They're currently listed as vulnerable, and so the shark's massive presence in the poem is, I think, shadowed by an even larger absence, the long grief of species decline which it effectively inhabits. But Jamie also negotiates her own presence and absence. She's initially present in the poem as an acting, mobile presence, somebody who arrives on the scene, but quickly is reduced to a point of perception, a looking eye only. And at the poem's close, her presence is not reinstated. It doesn't move back out to Jamie on the cliff and kind of remaining or leaving. The final stanza, in fact, ends with vision obscured, whereupon the wind in its mercy breathed again, and far below the surface glittered and broke up. The poet also dissolves effectively in the disturbed waters of the shark's passage, dissolves into the scene, but I think, implicitly at least, resolves into another kind of understanding of her entanglement in the scene. Basking Shark, therefore, is a poem about the ethical value of this kind of enchanted gaze. in that it initiates a passage into looking as a kind of witnessing, a form of witnessing. Witnessing that can be costly, painful, unbearable, as Jamie puts it, but can also be transformative and essential if we are to find gestures by which to acknowledge our lively relationship with other lives in a time of extinction. That's it.